you're listening to Observations, a podcast where we talk about democracy, how it works, and how it could work better. I'm your host, Lily Russell-Jones. In July, the government set out proposals to reform our electoral system, including lowering the voting age to 16, expanding voter ID to include bank cards, and tackling the harassment of political candidates. Today, we'll be talking about the somewhat controversial decision to lower the voting age to 16 ahead of the next general election and how this could affect our democracy. I'm joined by Eddie Barnes from the John Smith Centre at Glasgow University. Thank you for joining me, Eddie.
Pleasure.
Later in the episode, we'll be hearing from the campaigner Alex Nerton and the psychologist Lynette Thompson. Eddie, to start us off, do you think that giving the vote to 16-year-olds is a positive step for our democracy?
Yes, I do. I think it's slightly qualified by some of the polling that we've done, which I'm happy to get into. But I think, broadly speaking, I'm, as you say, at the University of Glasgow. In Scotland, votes at 16 has been in now for a decade. Indeed, it was when the independence referendum, more than a decade ago, when we saw a lot of engagement amongst 16 and 17-year-olds during that referendum. I think there is evidence to show that the younger people get involved in politics, the more they are likely to remain involved and to stay active in their and engaged in active civic and political life. So I think it's not just about giving young people the vote, which I think is itself a good thing, but it's also about sustaining the kind of long-term health of our democracy. I think it's a good thing for that too.
And for listeners who are unfamiliar, could you tell us a bit about the work of the John Smith Centre and your role there?
Of course. So named after John Smith, the former leader of the Labour Party who died in 1994, and who went to Glasgow University. And what we do at the university and try to do across the UK is really to kind of nurture young people and encourage and inspire young people who want to get involved in public life and politics. So that's through practical work, but also through campaigns. So as I say, we do a bit of polling and we do kind of campaign work on the back of that to try and remove any barriers that are out there for young people who might want to get involved in politics or public life, but feel that it's not for them or feel it's for other people. And we're trying to make the argument it is for you and you should get involved, both for yourself and for the country.
So let's talk about how the current system works in the UK, because you touched on it in your first answer. So 16 and 17-year-olds can't currently vote in general elections, but in Scotland and Wales, they are allowed to vote in certain elections.
That's correct. I mean, as you say, young people in general election in Scotland is the same as anywhere else, can't vote at 16, 17. But they have voted in numbers over in Scotland for several years. And I think, I don't have the numbers to hand, but I think there's evidence that the voting rates among 16 and 17-year-olds are actually higher than they are for people in maybe their late teens, early 20s. And again, there's some kind of good reasons for that. 16, 17-year-olds tend to still be at school. They tend to still be at home. So this is a time where they're in an environment where, either through parental encouragement or through school encouragement, they're getting a little bit of politics, a little bit of public life in their world. So again, it's a good opportunity, we think, to get them involved at that stage and to maintain their interest throughout their lives.
And why do you think we've seen the government put forward this decision now?
I think, the kind of cynical argument has been, a Labour government will benefit from more young people voting. I'm not entirely sure that's true, for voting for them, that is, because of the evidence that young people are more likely to vote leftwards than rightwards. As I say, I'm not entirely sure that's true, because I think there'll be some evidence that perhaps 16, 17-year-olds might go for other parties of the left rather than the Labour Party. But I'd like to think it's down to the evidence and the evidence that we've seen in Scotland and Wales, where it has been a success. And I'd like to think also it's down to the fact that, we know that when we speak to young people, and we do this quite a lot, there are concerns that they express around democracy. People's faith and trust in democracy as a system that, advances their lives is on notice, I think it's fair to say. So I think I'd like to think that the motive is to try and ensure that we do encourage more people to take part in our democracy and therefore strengthen the democratic norms that we have rather taken for granted, but I don't think can anymore. So I think it's perhaps a combination of self-interest, but also national interest, which has stimulated this decision.
And it's been a somewhat controversial decision. There's been quite a lot of argument back and forth about whether this is a good idea. So, what do you make of the argument that young people, 16-year-olds, might not be mature enough or knowledgeable enough to vote?
I wouldn't dismiss it. I mean, I think like in every age group, it's not just 16, 17-year-olds. Frankly, I'm 53, and there'll be plenty of 53-year-olds who probably have not spent vast amounts of time studying the political options that they've got. So that isn't just confined to young people. The kind of lack of knowledge, if you like, of politics, or lack of kind of political literacy, if you like. What I think I would say is we've done some research into this, and it's quite clear that a lot of young people who now are going to get the vote don't feel particularly well prepared or equipped to use that vote and to take an informed choice. So I think it's, as I say, I'm a supporter of it. I think it's the right thing to do. I think most 16 and 17-year-olds are perfectly mature enough to be able to make an informed choice. But I think we do need to do more to ensure that all young people, as I say, do feel as though they have the right preparation, the right, more knowledge to be able to make a choice that they feel makes a difference and isn't just sprung on them without them really knowing what to do about it.
Yeah, and I think that's a really good segue into the research that you did over summer. So, the John Smith Centre carried out this poll of 500 16 and 17-year-olds, and they were quite divided over whether or not they should be allowed to vote, which I thought was very interesting. So, 48% of young people agreed that they should get the vote, but 32% disagreed and 20% weren't sure. So, why do you think that young people aren't sure about whether or not they should be voting?
I think it's because a lot of them don't feel as though they know enough to use the vote. So, as you say, it was quite divided. Not everybody thinks they should get it, although the plurality of young people did. But when we asked young people, do you feel ready enough, prepared enough, if you like, to use the vote? 2/3 said no, that they didn't feel prepared by schools to use those vote. When we asked those people who said that they were unlikely to use their vote, 3/4 of them said it was because they didn't know enough about politics. It wasn't because they thought politics is toxic or irrelevant. They just didn't know enough about this subject matter and therefore felt, well, since I don't know much about this, I won't be exercising my right to vote. And then we did that classic thing of asking young people, could you just sum up your view of politics and public life in one word? And the most common response we got back was the word confusing. And that was followed by complicated and boring. So I think the overall message we get from that is that, sure, most young people think it's a good thing to get a vote, but a large number of them say, I might not vote, and it's because I really don't know enough about this. It's an extremely confusing, bewildering world you're asking me to go into. Therefore, I might just butt out. And frankly, my school is not helping me much in giving me the right adequate preparation to feel I can make an informed voice. So, overall message, I think, to the government is great. I think it's the right thing to do. I think, broadly speaking, it's a good thing to do, but it is only the first step. And there's not much point saying, here, young people, have a vote and then walk off without doing more to ensure that young people have the opportunity to learn and discover more about politics.
And what do you think is going wrong here in terms of young people not feeling like they are informed? Because as part of the national curriculum in England, we have to do sort of citizenship lessons, and at secondary school level, you're meant to learn about how the country is governed and also how to engage in democracy. And yet, despite that, we still see that young people don't feel like politics is very accessible for them.
Yeah, I think you're right. I mean, there is. I think that provision of education, from what I gather myself, is quite patchy.
Yeah.
So what you do, some schools will do it great, and they'll have citizenship, democracy education, where young people get to understand about the rights they have around politics, media literacy, the skills that they need, if you like, to understand the country around them. But others won't, and it's perhaps one of those Cinderella subjects, that doesn't get the priority it should do, as schools are kind of forced, or rather kind of feel the need to focus on core curricular subjects, that are the ones that they're going to, at the end of the day, get judged on. So I think my view would be that something that is seen as being a little extra, a little added on extra, i.e., citizenship education, democracy education, shouldn't be, and it actually should be, seen as a much more important part of the school curriculum, if we're going to really kind of ensure young people feel part of society.
And how do you think social media factors into considerations about lowering the voting age? Because your polling also showed that 49% of young people trust social media over traditional media as their main source of information. So I wondered if you felt like younger voters are going to be more at risk from disinformation and potentially being exposed to extreme views.
Yes, I think social media, in some ways, we shouldn't just always kind of reach for the negative. In my view, I think what it does do is at least you know, it's something that ensures that whether it's high or low quality information, does mean that there is a channel there that can ensure young people get plenty of political information coming through the door. That said, as you say, the risk of disinformation, misinformation is a big challenge. And again, I think that only feeds back to the reason why we probably do need more citizenship education. For example, that would include lessons on how to distinguish fake news from real news, how to source information, how do you go about discovering whether something is real or isn't. How do you analyze something and not just take something at face value, but look for other opinions as well, and make your own mind up on the basis of a variety of opinions. That's what we're talking about here in terms of how the kind of citizenship education, media education that is necessary for young people to get. Because, yeah, as I say, while social media has great opportunities, clearly there are problems with it too, and that's something that young people are very conscious of. I think there's certainly the young people we speak to are very aware that they're living in this kind of maelstrom, this blizzard of information that's just coming at them all the time. And they are trying to find ways to navigate their way through that blizzard. And we need schools, I think, should be providing more help for them to actually do that, because it is clearly a problem.
Yes, and I think it's difficult for people of all age groups as well
Yeah, of
to
course.
distinguish on social media
It is.
between.
I suppose the difference is that those of us who are slightly older are still kind of using like legacy media in a way that young people now just don't. Um, so, um, you know, so it's more likely to be something that
Yeah.
is more challenging for the younger generation.
The last time that the voting age was lowered was in 1969 when it dropped from 21 to 18. Do you think that we could see it drop even lower in future, or for there to potentially be a cap introduced on voting age?
My guess would be that's probably it, in terms of the age range. I mean, there are some children's rights groups that think that we should scrap it all together, and essentially you should have everybody should be able to have the right to vote no matter what. But I would guess this is about it now. I mean, I don't know if you've got an international example of some countries where it's below 16, but
No, I don't
I can't
actually.
think
I
of
think
one.
16 is the lowest I'm aware of,
Yeah,
and 25 the highest.
is that right? Gosh, okay.
Yes, apparently, in the United Arab Emirates.
Oh, right, okay, fine, very good.
And do you have any children yourself, Eddie?
Yes, I do. Funnily enough, I was just as I was saying, I have three teenagers, one of whom will turn 16 a few weeks before the Scottish elections in May of next year. So he will be 16 in about a month. and about a month, and will therefore be able to vote. We've registered him so that he is able to vote next May. And while I'm a little bit skeptical that he's necessarily that interested in politics, he's far more interested in his PlayStation than politics. One thing it has done is prompted a few conversations about what he might do. And, you never know. It might just trigger something in his mind about his kind of rights and responsibilities come next May.
And how do you
I'm
feel
not
about?
holding out too much hope, however.
Sorry, how do you feel about him having the ability to vote?
Well, there's a little bit of parental skepticism because he's my little boy, and he's the youngest one of three. So maybe we have a tendency to think of him as being a little bit young. But the beauty here is that all his friends will also be able to vote. The school will be able to inform them about the choices that they've got on offer, and that's an opportunity for him at the age of 16 to take part in a big moment in our national life. And taking a step back, I think that's one of the really good things about votes of 16. It's saying to young people, you do have a stake. You do have a share in this country, albeit a very small one, like the rest of us. But you, like others, now are part of the democratic life of this country. And I think that's a very, very good message to be sending out to young people today.
Thank you so much for your time, Eddie.
My pleasure.
I'm now joined by Lynette Thompson, an Associate Professor of Psychology at Northeastern University in London. Thank you for joining me, Lynette.
And thank you for having me, Lily. Thanks.
You're welcome. I wanted to get a psychologist's perspective on this because one of the main counter arguments to lowering the voting age to 16 is that 16-year-olds might not be mature enough to vote or knowledgeable enough. But is there any scientific basis for that?
Well, in fact, the scientific evidence shows that 16-year-olds are cognitively quite capable of voting, but whether they have the maturity levels, whether they have the life experience, that is another argument. So if we go back to the biological aspects of the brain and how the brain works for the adolescent as opposed to the 18-year-old or the 21-year-old, we know that our brain develops from, in simplistic terms, from the back to the front. Right? So in the front part of our brain, which is the prefrontal cortex, is the last one to develop. Now, while the adolescent's brain is physically in terms of size and structure the same size as an adult brain, it only fully develops by the time they hit the mid-20s, around about 25 when it fully develops. So before the prefrontal cortex develops, which is the part that's most responsible for decision making, planning, what we call executive functioning, higher order thinking, before that develops or is fully developed, the limbic system is more active, and the limbic system develops earlier than this prefrontal cortex. And in the limbic system, we have the amygdala, which is the part of the brain which is really controls emotion and is responsible for motion and things like risk-taking and impulsivity. So that's why we find that 16-year-olds will, or adolescents will be more risk-taking behaviors. They'll have mood swings, and they may have increased levels of aggression.
So how does that come into the idea of a 16-year-old voting? Does that mean that they might find it harder to make a decision that's rational and be more prone to impulsive decisions?
So that's a very good question, because while they may be more impulsive, that is when they have to make decisions on the spur of the moment. What psychologist Sternberg calls cold cognition versus hot cognition. So hot cognition is when we have to make very impulsive decisions, right? But when it comes to something like voting, we're not voting on impulse. We're voting with information at hand. We're voting with knowledge. And so one would say that they are actually voting under the the umbrella of cold cognition, where they had time to think, where they had time to learn, where they had time to gain that information, whether it is from family or from schools or from civic organizations or associations, where they'd gathered that time. So they wouldn't make a decision in terms of voting impulsively as they would with necessarily other decisions. And that is why you'll find that there are arguments for a 16-year-old to vote, because in that specific space where they are voting and where they're on their own in that ballot box, they may not necessarily be influenced by their peers where they may otherwise would have been.
I think as a society, we tend to think of 18 as this cutoff point because it's the age of responsibility in many ways, where you can get married without your parents' consent, you can drink alcohol, you could stand as a candidate for an election. But is there really a psychological or biological basis for that cutoff?
No, the biology doesn't, or the physiology doesn't really show that there's a major difference between the 16 and the 18-year-old. Obviously, as we move from the adolescent brain to the period that I spoke about around the mid-20s, with every year we know that the prefrontal cortex is developing, and that opportunity or that ability to have rational thought, to have that decision making and that executive functioning does increase. But the period between 16 and 18 would not be that markedly different unless the 16 and the 18-year-olds' life experiences are markedly different. That is what would also play a role between the 16 and 18-year-old. Yeah, so that would be the argument that some countries would use for the fact that we could easily lower the age. Personally, I think that lowering the age is probably more political than it is a psychological decision. It does increase the voter base, but um, there isn't a real biological difference between that 18 and 16-year-old, outside of the fact that the 18-year-old will have 2 more years of life experience. And so the country may want to consider that and feel that, well, we want to have voters who have a little bit of more life experience and knowledge than someone who doesn't. And that would be the key difference between the two age groups.
Yes, because you mentioned that the brain doesn't fully develop until you're in your mid-20s, but I'm guessing you're not in favour of raising the voting age to be in line with that.
No, I'm not in favor of raising the voting age, because I believe that 16-year-olds are still very impressionable. And yes, I did mention the fact that if you give them the right information, but they are still very impressionable. They do have a strong sense of wanting to belong and still working on their identity. And so those things can also play a role in the decisions that they make, and voting could be one of those decisions.
Yes, how do you imagine that could manifest itself in terms of wanting to belong and feeling that social pressure and when it
Well,
comes to
if
voting?
if your friends are talking about voting for a certain party, and you really feel that this friendship group is important to you, and there's discussion around voting, and you thinking of voting for a different party, that may exclude you from that group. And your friends may see you as having different values and belief systems to them, and then not include you. And that inclusion, or that risk of being excluded, is a very real risk, and it's not a risk that a 16-year-old may want to take. And he or she may not be mature enough to say, well, these are my beliefs and my value system. This is who I vote for. This is who my parents vote for. And whether you like it or not, this is what I stand by. Does the 16-year-old have that strength and that maturity to put that out there to the friendship group and risk being excluded from that group?
Mm. So it's really the social side of the 16-year-old's life and identity which might make it difficult to come to an independent decision here.
Definitely. That may play a role. Not saying that would be true for all 16-year-olds, but that would definitely play a role, especially if their identity is not self-identity. Their identity is not really fully formed, or they're still grappling with what their identity is. And if their identity is rather steeped in their friendship group, because a
Yeah.
lot of them, their self-identity is based on who they associate with. So if
Yeah.
that is not really formed and cemented, that could be quite fragile.
Yes, that's really helpful. Thank you so much for your time on this issue. If it was up to you, do you think that you would lower the voting age to 16?
As someone who studies developmental psychology and teaches developmental psychology, if it was up to me, I would not be in favor of voting or lowering the voting age to 16. I
Yes,
would not be in favor.
even though there's not a really big marked difference between a 16 and 18-year-old's brain.
I would still not be in favor of lowering it, no.
Why is that?
Merely because I think that at 16, there's still a lot of there's constant change in emotions. And remember, the hormones also play a role. It affects mood, it affects decision making. And I think that because of this constant change, I think they are not yet stable enough to make a decision to choose a party that's going to lead a country for the next 5 years. That's just my opinion, that they're not stable enough to make that decision for a long-term decision.
Okay, thank you. That's really helpful. And is that because it's harder for a 16-year-old to think through the consequences of their decisions? Is there a psychological basis for that?
It's that often they may make a decision today and realize tomorrow that that wasn't the decision that they should have made, or now that arguably that may be the same for any other adult, but they go through that much more, and it's much more. There's much more wave in their emotions, and because their decisions are so much based on their emotions, it's like they may be making a decision, 5 days in a row, 5 different parties. They may decide, they may change their mind on, because they're also grappling with information that they get and how to process that. And every time they get new information and process that information, it may it may influence their decisions.
Okay. So you think that it is possible for 16-year-olds to make informed decisions in the right conditions?
Under the right conditions, yes.
But
yes.
your personal view is that
Correct.
lowering the voting age means that there's a greater risk that people are going to be voting who maybe haven't thought through that decision as much, or are influenced by peer pressure, things like that.
Correct.
Okay. Thank you so much, Lynette. That's been fascinating.
Thank you, Lily.
I'm now joined by Alex Nerton, a member of the Youth Parliament who's campaigned for a lower voting age. And crucially, Alex, you're 17.
Yeah.
Thank you for joining us. So, Alex, how did you feel when you heard that the government was planning to legislate to lower the voting age to 16?
Oh, I mean, I was just, at the moment, I was overwhelmed because I woke up to my mum on the phone, waking me up, telling me the news. So, literally that morning was kind of crazy. But yeah, my thoughts after were just I was just so thankful that this has now happened, because this is something that the UK Youth Parliament have been campaigning for 20 years now. So honestly, it just feels like it's a long time coming.
Could you talk a little bit about your work with the National Youth Parliament? So what exactly is it? How does it work? And you chair a committee on votes for 16-year-olds, is that right?
Yeah. So UK Youth Parliament, or UKYP, is a UK-wide sort of network for young people to get involved, put themselves forward for elections, get voted in by young people. We have about 300 MYPs across the UK, so we represent people up and down the UK. And through this, there's opportunities like annual conference, which is when we come together, explain what our constituents want and what issues affect young people. Then we vote to see what our national focus is. So right now we're focusing on Vote 16 and period dignity. So from that, we then have the campaign committee, from which I'm a vice chair. I'm the chair of the Vote 16 one. We obviously have another one for period dignity. But from that, we've now been able to influence decision makers and really get our voice heard.
And is the idea with that you don't have decision-making power necessarily, but you can feed that up to politicians who can then take forward your policy ideas, things like that?
Yeah, basically. I mean, as chair of the Vote 16 committee, we hear from representatives from all regions of the UK. That gets fed up, sort of up the chain to see what young people want. And then from that, we have our voice heard by lawmakers and decision makers.
And when did you first become interested in politics?
I mean, part of me thinks I've always been interested in politics. My mum's a teacher, so obviously I have an interest in education and how that's been affected. But I got involved with Surrey Youth Cabinet in, I think it was November 2022 now. So from that, I then heard about Youth Parliament and then put myself forward. And then now I'm here today talking to you.
And why are you so passionate about 16 and 17-year-olds getting the right to vote?
Well, 16 and 17-year-olds have been sort of ignored by politicians. You know, it's only really old people that vote. So because of that, we have a democracy which focuses policies on old people. And so young people, 16 and 17-year-olds, are being left behind when we should have a say on things that affect our present, but also our future. Things like climate change. Young people, like 16 and 17-year-olds, are going to be more affected by that than older people.
And you're more politically engaged, I would say, than many adults. So is that something that sets you apart, do you think, from other 16 and 17-year-olds?
I mean, it's a good question. Obviously, not many of my friends are in youth parliament. But yeah, I think young people really, they don't get the credit they deserve for being as politically engaged as they are. They might not be into party politics, but, young people care a lot about social issues like climate change and the state of the world right now, international conflicts. These are all things that young people do actually care about. And I think now giving them a voice, we'll now start engaging in conversations where young people can feel involved.
Okay, because earlier in the episode, we heard from the John Smith Centre at Glasgow University, and basically they carried out a poll over summer of 500 16 to 17-year-olds. And the results found that young people were quite divided over whether they should get the vote. So 48% said they agreed that 16 and 17-year-olds should get the vote, 32% disagreed, and 20% didn't know. So what do you make of the fact that there is this sense among some young people that they're not ready to have the vote?
Well, I think you just summed that up greatly. Young people don't feel like they're ready to vote because they don't have the political education that they deserve and need. This is why the UK Youth Parliament have been campaigning for political literacy, the idea that in schools UK-wide, we need to be teaching people about our democracy and the importance of it, and the importance of voting and what that does, and how our institutions work. These are all things that 16, 17-year-olds need to learn and grow up knowing, so that we have a generation of people who fundamentally understand how our institutions work and why their voice matters.
So from your perspective, have you had much political education from school? Do you feel like that's the main place that you've been able to learn about politics, or has it come from home?
Yeah, no, a lot of it is school. I mean, if I can shout out my political teacher, Mr. Convent, he also does like the PSHE lessons, so like life skills lessons. He manages all of that. So I think at my school it's quite good, but what we're learning is UK-wide, there is massive differences in what you learn in school about politics.
Yeah. And do you think that there therefore needs to be a more joined up way of young people being taught about politics?
Oh, absolutely, yeah. We need mandatory political education across the UK. That's something that young people want, and we see that through Youth Parliament. I've had like several conversations about this at annual conference, and this is something that young people really want, because there are disparities in what is being taught about politics.
And so if I was to distill your argument in favour of having votes for 16 and 17-year-olds into one key message, what would that be? What's the strongest argument, do you think, in favour of lowering the voting age?
Well, I mean, it's kind of simple. Young people just deserve a voice. There is nothing that fundamentally changes when you turn 18. Because I'm in year 13, all my friends around me are now turning like 18 years old. So one of my friends came up to me the other day, and it was his birthday over the weekend, and he said, "Oh, how do you feel now that I can vote and you still can't?" And I sort of said to him, like, "Oh yeah, that must be great. Like, can you let me in on like what's the secret now? Like, you must like have matured because now you're 18, you can vote. Like, what happened? Let me in on the secret." And he just looked at me like all confused. But it goes back to this point that, nothing fundamentally changes when you're 18, and 16 and 17-year-olds are affected by all the same decisions. So it's only fair that 16 and 17-year-olds can have their voice heard.
So when it comes to thinking about 18-year-olds, so we have that as the age of responsibility in our society in many ways, because that's the age you can drink alcohol, that's the age you can get married without your parents' consent, things like that. But do you think that it makes sense to have a different voting age if it becomes lower? Or do you think that we should be lowering the age of responsibility in all things to 16?
No, I don't think we should lower the alcohol drinking age or anything like that. This is about giving young people a voice. So the age to vote in Ireland and Scotland is 16. 16 is becoming that number where you are seen in the eyes of the law as having that responsibility to have your voice heard.
Do you think that the same argument could be made for people who are younger? So lowering the voting age further to bring more people into politics?
Yeah, but we're seeing that 16 is becoming the new age. We see that across the UK and internationally.
And you're somebody who's very in touch with young people and their opinions. So what kind of political issues do you think matter to young people the most?
Yeah, I think definitely things like climate change. That is going to affect young people much more than old people because it's our issue that we're inheriting. But also international conflicts, even things like education. How is an 80-year-old who hasn't been in education for decades more responsible to make decisions about education than young people who are actually affected by those decisions?
Okay, and final question, Alex. Do you know what you want to do when you're older? Have you thought about what you might like to be?
I mean, it's corny, but I just want to help people. That's what I really care about.
Can you see yourself going into politics?
Probably.
Okay, well, we can leave it there. Thank you so much for your time.
Thank you so much.
So, is lowering the voting age a positive step for our democracy? Well, it remains to be seen. Lowering the voting age could increase democratic engagement once young people gain the vote and get a say on issues which matter to them. Some experts think it will help to improve election turnout long term by engaging people in the democratic process younger in their lives. However, there are concerns about whether 16-year-olds have the maturity to make a considered, independent and fully informed decision. Something all our speakers agreed on was that if young people are to have the vote, they should also have access to educational resources which help them to feel better informed about politics. Democracy Volunteers, the organisation behind the Observations podcast, which trains volunteers to observe elections and make sure they're carried out in a free and fair way, has said its observers will be looking out for changes in behaviour at polling booths once the voting age has been lowered. For example, family voting, a practice where family members go into a polling booth together and try to direct how their relative is voting, could be exacerbated if parents accompany teenage children to vote. You've been listening to Observations. Today, you've heard from Eddie Barnes of the John Smith Centre at the University of Glasgow, Lynette Thompson, an Associate Professor of Psychology at Northeastern University, and Alex Nerton, a 17-year-old member of the National Youth Parliament. I'm Lily Russell-Jones, your host. If you enjoyed today's episode, please like and subscribe. You can find us on YouTube at Observations Podcast. Thank you for listening.
The Observations podcast is being brought to you by Democracy Volunteers, the UK's leading election observation group. Democracy Volunteers is non-partisan and does not necessarily share the opinions of participants in the podcast. It brings the podcast to you to improve knowledge of elections, both national and international.